Asking for what I deserved wasn't bold. It wasn't aggressive. It was just honest. I had spent 3 years building something from nothing, and when my manager at the time, a fair woman named Diane, sat me down and said the company was doing well enough to finally reward the people who made it that way. I didn't hesitate. I told her I thought my compensation should reflect what I actually contributed. She agreed. She put it in writing. And then she left. That was the beginning of everything. My name is Sophie Renner. I was 28 when all of this started, working as a financial analyst at a mid-sized consulting firm based in Auckland called Meridian Advisory. We weren't a flashy company. We didn't have a rooftop bar or a branded coffee machine in the kitchen. What we had was a solid reputation for delivering clean, accurate financial audit frameworks to corporate clients across the Pacific. And that reputation was built on a process I had quietly rebuilt from the ground up over the course of 2 years. When I joined Meridian at 25, fresh out of my postgrad, and honestly a little terrified, the audit review process was a mess. Outdated spreadsheets, inconsistent reporting templates, review cycles that dragged on for weeks because nobody had ever standardized the workflow. My first manager, Diane, noticed fairly quickly that I had a habit of fixing things without being asked. She gave me room to work. Within 18 months, I had designed what became known internally as the ClearPath framework, a structured audit methodology that cut our client review cycles by nearly 40% and eliminated most of the rework that used to eat up junior staff. Hours. It wasn't glamorous work. I spent a lot of late evenings alone in the office with a cold flat white and a spreadsheet that refused to cooperate. But it worked, and eventually, the whole team was using it, and then other teams across the firm were using it, and then the firm started including it in client pitches as a point of difference. Diane championed it. She made sure leadership knew where it came from. She signed off on a raise recommendation and told me it was in the pipeline. Then she accepted a senior role at another firm and was gone within a fortnight. I wasn't devastated. I was happy for her. She was brilliant, and she deserved it. But her leaving meant that the raise she had recommended was now sitting in a pending folder somewhere, attached to a manager who no longer existed, waiting for someone new to either honor it or quietly let it disappear. The someone new was a man named Craig Whitfield. Craig came in from a larger firm in Sydney. He was 43, well-dressed in the way that always felt slightly too deliberate, and he had a way of talking about transformation that made you feel like you'd been doing everything wrong until the moment he arrived. He called his first all-hands meeting in the 3rd week of February and used the word pivot 4 times in 12 minutes. I counted. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I always do, with new people. I introduced myself properly, walked him through the ClearPath framework, explained its history, and how it tied into the firm's current client commitments. He listened with the polite but slightly glazed expression of someone who has already decided what they think and is simply waiting for you to finish. He thanked me for the overview. He said he liked to take time to understand the landscape before making changes. He made changes within 3 weeks. The first thing I noticed was that a colleague of mine, a guy named Marcus, who had joined about 8 months earlier, straight out of his undergrad, cheerful and eager, but genuinely underprepared for the kind of client-facing work we did, started being included in meetings. I wasn't invited to senior client meetings, strategy sessions with the partners. At first I assumed it was developmental, that Craig was rotating people through different experiences. I figured my turn was coming. It wasn't coming. By the end of March, Craig called me into his office for what he described as a restructure conversation. He explained that he was reorganizing the team to better align with his vision for the division. He said he was moving me into a support analyst role, which he described as a critical enabler position, which meant I would be providing data and documentation to the senior analysts rather than leading client engagements directly. He said it with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He said he thought I would thrive in a role that played to my detail-oriented strengths. I sat very still for a moment. I asked about the raise that Diane had recommended. He said he wasn't aware of any formal recommendation in my file. I asked him to check again. He said he would look into it. He never brought it up again. I walked back to my desk, sat down, opened my laptop, and stared at my screen for probably 2 full minutes without seeing anything on it. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even particularly angry. Not yet. I was just recalibrating, processing the information, deciding what it meant and what I was going to do about it. What I decided in those 2 minutes was to say nothing. Not to Craig, not to the partners, not to anyone. I was going to do my job exactly as I always had. I was going to continue maintaining and updating ClearPath because I was still technically the person responsible for it, and nobody had told me otherwise. And I was going to wait and watch and see what happened next. Marcus took over my client-facing responsibilities. He was earnest, and he tried hard, and I genuinely didn't dislike him, but he hadn't built the framework he was now presenting to clients as his methodology. He didn't know the load-bearing parts of it, the calculations that had to be sequenced in a specific order, the audit checkpoints that couldn't be skipped without compromising the integrity of the whole structure. When clients asked him technical questions in meetings, he would sometimes give answers that were approximately right, but not precisely right. And in financial auditing, approximately right is a category of wrong. I noticed this from my new position on the periphery. Nobody was asking me to attend those meetings anymore, but I still had access to the shared documentation and the client folders. I still processed the data that came through. I could see exactly what was being submitted to clients and when. In April, Craig announced that Meridian had been shortlisted for the Apex Pacific contract. It was a large infrastructure company headquartered in Wellington, expanding significantly across the Pacific Rim, and they needed an audit framework partner for a 5-year engagement. The contract value was somewhere around $45 million. It was the biggest opportunity the Auckland office had pursued in years, possibly ever. The partners were visibly excited. There were catered lunches. Someone bought a celebratory cake that said shortlisted on it in blue icing. Craig assigned Marcus as the lead analyst on the Apex pitch. He would present the ClearPath methodology, which he had started calling the Meridian Integrated Audit Model in client materials, which I noticed but said nothing about to the Apex leadership team, in a full-day presentation in Wellington at the end of May. I was assigned to prepare the supporting documentation. I did my job. I prepared the documentation carefully and accurately, as I always did. I flagged, in the internal notes section of the working file, 2 calculation sequences that Marcus had adjusted in the template the previous month. His adjustments were based on a misunderstanding of how the weighted risk index interacted with the compliance threshold variables. They weren't immediately obvious errors. They would produce results that looked plausible on the surface, but would begin to diverge from reality over a rolling 12-month period. I flagged them in the notes. I sent Marcus a message through the internal system, pointing him to the flags. I received no response. The flags stayed in the notes, unaddressed. I want to be precise about this, because I have thought about it carefully many times since. I did not alter anything. I did not break anything. I did not set anything up to fail. I identified errors that someone else had introduced. I documented them through the proper internal channel, and when nothing was done about it, I continued doing my job and said nothing more. The errors were not mine to fix. The framework had been handed to someone else. My role, as Craig had made very clear, was support. The Apex presentation was scheduled for the 28th of May. I was not included in the Wellington delegation. Craig went. Marcus went. 2 of the partners went. I stayed in Auckland and processed incoming data requests. I found out what happened through a colleague named Priya, who had a contact in the Wellington office of a firm that had also been shortlisted for the Apex contract. Priya told me the next morning, quietly, over coffee in the small kitchen near the back of the office. Apparently, the presentation had gone smoothly for the first 3 hours. Marcus had delivered the overview competently. The Apex team had asked detailed questions about the framework's application to infrastructure-scale audits. And then one of their internal analysts, a very sharp woman, from what Priya heard, had pulled up a specific scenario and run it through the model in real time, wanting to see how it handled a multi-jurisdictional compliance variable. The output didn't match what she expected. She ran it again. Same result. She asked Marcus to walk her through the calculation logic. He explained it. She shook her head and said the weighting sequence was producing results that would underestimate compliance risk by a significant margin over an extended audit period. She showed her working. Marcus couldn't counter it because she was correct. The Apex team excused themselves for 20 minutes. When they came back, their head of finance said they appreciated the time and would be in touch. They were not in touch. Meridian lost the contract to the other shortlisted firm within the week. I heard about the postmortem through the same channels. Craig had apparently told the partners that the framework had contained a legacy error that hadn't been caught in review. He did not mention that the error had been introduced 4 weeks before the presentation. He did not mention the flagged notes in the working file. Priya heard he had implied the issue originated with documentation work rather than the framework adjustments. She looked at me when she told me that part. I opened the internal system and took a screenshot of the flagged notes and the timestamp on my message to Marcus. Then I saved a copy to my personal drive. I went back to my desk and kept working. What happened after that unfolded over about 6 weeks, and most of it happened without me doing anything at all except showing up and doing my job well. The first thing was that one of the partners, a quiet, precise man named Robert, who had been at the firm for nearly 20 years, asked to meet with me. He said he was doing a review of the Apex project timeline and wanted to understand the documentation workflow. I walked him through everything calmly and factually. I showed him the notes I had flagged. I showed him the timestamp on my message to Marcus. I didn't editorialize. I didn't say Craig had buried it, or that Marcus had ignored a critical warning. I just showed him the timeline as it existed in the system, and I let him draw his own conclusions. He thanked me and didn't say much else at the time. But 2 days later, he asked me for a full technical brief on the ClearPath framework, its original design, its methodology, its validation history. I spent a weekend writing it. I included everything: the original problem it had been designed to solve, the testing process, the performance metrics from the 2 years it had been in operation before the adjustments. Around the same time, Apex Pacific's head of analytics, the sharp woman from the presentation, whose name I later found out was Janet, sent a message through the firm's general inquiry channel asking whether Meridian had any documentation on the original framework that had underpinned the pitch model. Apparently, she had been intrigued enough by what she'd seen in the first 3 hours to want to understand it better. Robert forwarded her message to me and asked me to respond. I responded. I sent her the full technical brief. She replied within an hour, asking if I was available for a call. We spoke for 45 minutes. She was methodical and exacting, and asked exactly the right questions. She said the framework I had described was precisely what Apex had been looking for. She said the version they had seen in Wellington had clearly diverged from the original in ways that hadn't been explained to them. She said she would be speaking with her leadership team. I thanked her and went home and made dinner and tried not to think about it too much. 3 weeks later, Apex Pacific contacted Meridian directly and proposed a separate engagement, a 12-month framework design and audit support contract, specifically requesting that I lead it. They had run their own evaluation after the Wellington meeting and concluded that the methodology had genuine value. They wanted the person who had built it. The partners approved it within 48 hours. Craig called me into his office the morning after the approval came through. He sat behind his desk with the particular stillness of someone who is trying very hard to look unconcerned. He said he was glad the Apex relationship had recovered. He said this was a great outcome for the team. He said he hoped we could move forward collaboratively. I looked at him for a moment. I told him I appreciated the opportunity he had created, and that I had some things I wanted to discuss regarding my role and my compensation, and that I'd like to have that conversation with Robert present. Craig's expression shifted slightly. He said that seemed like an unusual request. I said I thought it made sense given the circumstances. We had the meeting the following Tuesday. I brought the technical brief, the performance history of ClearPath, the flagged documentation notes with their timestamps, and a clear, unemotional account of the restructure conversation in March and the raise that had been recommended and then never actioned. I didn't raise my voice. I wasn't bitter about it. I just laid out the facts in the same way I would present a financial audit. Here is what happened. Here is the evidence. Here is the impact. Robert was quiet throughout. Craig made a few attempts to reframe things, and Robert asked him to let me finish. When I was done, Robert asked me what outcome I was looking for. I told him I wanted my original role reinstated, the raise formally actioned at the figure Diane had recommended, and a written record in my HR file of my contributions to ClearPath and the Apex recovery. He said he thought that was reasonable. Craig left the room before the meeting formally ended. I was told later that he resigned 6 weeks after that, before the end of his first year. The partners didn't exactly fight to keep him. The Apex contract was signed in August. I flew down to Wellington for the kickoff meeting and sat across from Janet, who turned out to be exactly as sharp in person as she had been on the call. We had a very good working relationship for the duration of that contract, and beyond it. The engagement renewed twice. I still work at Meridian. I'm a senior analyst now. I have a team of 4. I have a coffee machine that actually works, and an office with a window that looks out over the harbor, which feels like an unreasonable luxury, and which I appreciate every single morning. People sometimes ask me what I would have done differently, whether I should have spoken up sooner, pushed harder, made more noise when the demotion happened. I've thought about it a lot, and I honestly don't think I would change much. I think there is a version of this story where I went in swinging, and everyone got defensive and dug into their positions, and the whole thing became a conflict about personalities instead of a conversation about facts. The facts were always on my side. I just needed the right moment for them to be visible. There is something I think about quite often, something I wish someone had told me when I was fresh out of postgrad and still figuring out how workplaces actually function. Your work is not separate from you, but your worth is not defined by how any one person chooses to see it at any one moment. Craig looked at what I had built and saw something he could redistribute to serve his own agenda. That said something about him, not about what I had built. The framework still worked. The methodology was still sound. The facts of what I had contributed didn't change because he decided to stop acknowledging them. If you're in a place right now where your work is being overlooked or reassigned or quietly claimed by someone else, document everything, not because you're preparing for war, but because clarity is a form of self-respect. Keep your records. Keep your timestamps. Keep your communications professional and factual, and free of the kind of language that can later be used against you. And then keep doing your job as well as you know how to do it, because the quality of your work is the argument that doesn't require anyone's permission to make. The truth doesn't need to be aggressive to be effective. It just needs to be accurate, and it needs to be patient. In my experience, it usually gets there in the end.